What's up, guys? I'm here with Chapter 37 of Book 1 of the Ranger's Apprentice The Early Years series, The Tournament at Gorlan, and we're going to go ahead and get into it. Pritchard peered round the doorway into the massive kitchen in the basement of Castle Gorlan. For the moment, the giant roasting pits and huge iron ovens weren't in use, but one of the kitchen maids was preparing a meal on a tray, as she did every day around midday. Having watched her for the past week, Pritchard knew the tray would be going to the isolated room in the tower, where Oswald was being held prisoner. He watched as the girl placed a bowl of thin broth onto the tray, then turned away to prepare a small plate of sliced chicken and green vegetables. The portions were never large. Morgarath had no intention of letting Oswald regain his strength, and Pritchard had noticed that the girl stirred a small quantity of white powder into the soup each day, pouring it from a small bottle she kept in her apron pocket. He was convinced that Oswald was being kept sedated, although he had overheard the girl being told by the kitchen master that the powder was a tonic. She was a good-hearted lass, and he knew she would have no willing part in keeping the old man in the tower drugged. Pritchard stepped down the 3 steps into the kitchen and moved toward her. She sensed him coming, looked up, and smiled. She liked the ragged old man who had taken to loitering round the kitchen, looking for scraps and handouts. He was invariably polite and courteous to her, and always thanked her profusely for the tidbits she gave him. And he had a delightful twinkle in his eyes, she thought. "Good morning, Belmore," she said now. That was the name he had given her. "Good morning, Mistress. How are—" Pritchard stopped in mid-sentence, and put his hand to his forehead, shaking his head. He staggered, regaining his balance by seizing the kitchen bench, and stood, swaying uncertainly, bewilderment and fear in his eyes. "Are you all right?" she asked anxiously, and he made a dismissive gesture, taking his hand away from his forehead to do so. "Just a little dizzy," he said, his voice quavering. "I didn't eat yesterday." The previous day he hadn't appeared in the castle kitchen. He'd been meeting with Errol and Prince Duncan. "You should have come to see me," she scolded. Forgetting the tray, she turned back to the work table and quickly sliced him a slab of bread from a fresh loaf, buttering it thickly, then poured a beaker of water for him. She placed the bread and water on the table and gestured to it. "Here, sit and have something to eat," she said. Pritchard moved cautiously toward the chair she indicated, keeping his balance with one hand on the workbench. Then he sat heavily and began to eat hungrily, washing the mouthfuls of fresh buttered bread down with cool water. "Ah," he said, "that's better. The gods bless you, Mistress." The girl smiled at him, relieved to see he was obviously over the fainting spell that had seized him. "You have to look after yourself, Belmore. You're not a young man anymore, and you know there's always plenty to spare in the kitchen. If you're hungry, just find me. I'll always get you something." He smiled at her. "Thank you, Mistress. You're too kind," he said. He felt a slight twinge of conscience over the fact that he had deceived her and taken advantage of her kindly nature. As she had turned away to fetch him food and drink, he had quickly slipped a folded scrap of parchment under the soup bowl. She patted his shoulder now, smiling at him. "I must be about my work," she said. "You sit here and eat your bread until you feel better." "I'm feeling better already, thanks to you," he replied warmly. She gathered up the tray and headed for the door out of the kitchen. "Take all the time you need," she said. "Nobody will bother you." Pritchard waited, listening to the sound of her light footsteps as she crossed the flagstones of the vast central hall and began the long climb up a series of winding stairways to the eastern tower. In spite of her best efforts, the broth would likely be little more than lukewarm by the time she delivered it, he knew. Once he was sure she had gone, he wolfed the last of the bread, which was fresh-baked and warm and quite delicious. Then he hurried out of the kitchen by a side door and made his way out of the castle grounds. He had become a familiar sight around Castle Gorlan over the past week, and was able to come and go virtually unhindered. In fact, he thought the guards and sentries probably didn't even notice him as he passed under the massive portcullis and made his way across the drawbridge. King Oswald glanced up from his chair as he heard the door of his turret room open. The sound of the large key grating in the lock was a reminder that he was a prisoner here in Gorlan. He sat at a table in his nightshirt, the only garment he had been given. A blanket was draped around his shoulders because the sentries would allow no fire in the turret room. "Can't have you burning yourself, Your Majesty," they'd sneered when he'd requested some warmth in the chilly room. High above the surrounding countryside like this, the turret room was subject to constant chill winds whistling round it and finding their way in through the gaps in the shutters. He managed a wan smile as the kitchen maid appeared with his meal. At least she was pleasant, he thought, and was constantly solicitous of his health. He coughed, the action wrecking his body. He felt weak and totally lacking in energy. He was sure they were putting something in his food to keep him drowsy and dispirited, but he didn't know where they were putting it, or what they were giving him. And truth be told, as each day went by, he cared less and less. He could feel his will to live, his will to resist Morgoth's constant demands that he disinherit his son, diminishing. Morgoth had made no bones about Duncan's current fate. King Oswald knew his son was being held prisoner by Morgoth's allies, and he knew that Duncan's life depended on his, Oswald's, doing as Morgoth commanded. He sighed unhappily. There had been a time when he had trusted Morgoth, but that time was long past, and now he realized he had been a fool to do so. He also knew that the minute he signed any proclamation naming Morgoth as his heir, Duncan's life would be over. Morgoth couldn't afford to let him live, and possibly re-challenge for the throne at a later date. All Oswald could do was continue to resist, although each day his will to do so became weaker and weaker. "Here you go, my lord," said the kitchen maid cheerfully. "A nice bit of chicken there, and some greens. Eat 'em up. They'll do you good." In spite of his situation, Oswald smiled tiredly. Her cheerful prattle reminded him of his old nanny when he was a boy. His nanny had been fond of telling him to eat up, it'll do you good. He picked up the chicken leg and took a nibble, but the maid scolded him good-naturedly. "Have the soup first," she said, "before it goes completely cold." She touched her hand to the side of the bowl, checking the temperature. "There's still a bit of warmth in it," she said. "Just what you need in this drafty old room." He nodded and picked up the clumsy wooden spoon. Morgoth had forbidden him the use of any iron implements, lest he try to fashion a makeshift weapon from them both. He took a sip. The broth was tepid and thin, without much nourishment in it, but he nodded his thanks to the girl. It wasn't her fault, after all. "Thank you, Mistress. You're too kind." She grinned at him and bobbed down in a curtsy. "Wish I could give you something more substantial," she said. but Lord Morgoth's healers say you need to keep to a low diet to prevent fevers." "I'm sure they do," he said dryly, taking another sip. Content that he was eating, she turned away and knocked on the door to be let out. The guards outside opened the door, and she departed. Oswald heard the key grate in the lock behind her. He looked at the watery broth and the small chicken leg. What was the point? He thought. "Keep your strength up," he said. He'd noticed that he'd taken to talking to himself over the past week or so. He thought that might be a bad sign. Then he shrugged the thought away. Bad sign or no, it made little difference to his situation. He dipped the spoon into the bowl once more and let the soup fill it. As he did so, he accidentally pushed the spoon against the far side of the bowl, moving it a few millimeters on the tray. He frowned as he saw the edge of a piece of parchment revealed under the soup bowl. He set the spoon down and moved the soup bowl to one side, revealing a small square of parchment that had been hidden underneath. There was writing on it. He picked it up and held it angled so that the light from the shuttered window fell on it. His lips moved as he made out the 5 words written there, and he felt a dull glow of hope in his breast. He read them again, to make sure he wasn't hallucinating, and this time he said them aloud. "Duncan is safe. Hold on." And that'll be the conclusion of chapter number 37. As always, I want to thank you all for joining me, and thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you next time in chapter 38. God bless, and have a good one.